All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Fueling Collaboration Panel Discussion Series. My name is Andrea Brandon, and I am a science delivery specialist with the Northern Research Station, and it's my absolute privilege to be hosting today's discussion. Before we get started, we do have a quick poll set up just as a way to get to know you who's participating. Amanda, would you mind please launching our poll? So we just have a couple of questions here, and we're asking if you could please, what best describes your work? Where are you physically located? And then how did you hear about today's webinar? So we'll keep this poll open for just a couple, maybe about 30 more seconds. I see a lot of folks are responding. Thank you so much for responding to this poll. It does help us better understand who's joining. So I see we're at about close to 70% response. We'll be closing this poll in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we can end that poll. Perfect. Thank you again so much. It looks like we've got a pretty diverse group of folks with us today, coming from lots of different locations across the United States, and also pretty diverse way that folks have heard about the Fueling Collaboration Panel Discussion Series. So again, thank you so much for that. So the Fueling Collaboration Panel Discussion Series is presented by the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Networks in the Eastern United States, as well as the Forest Service Northern Research Station and Southern Research Station. And our goal with Fueling Collaboration is to bring together researchers and land managers to learn about and to discuss fire science and application, to build collective learning, as well as to foster collaborative opportunities across the region. And today is the second panel discussion of this season's 4-part series. And in prior years and prior discussions, we've included topics such as prescribed fire and the WUI, using fire history to inform present-day management, fire seasonality, fire and water, and several more topics. And all of our panel discussions follow a similar format to what you're going to see today. It's a group discussion, minimal to no PowerPoint presentations, and our discussion is built on the questions that you submitted in advance. So thank you to everyone who did submit questions in advance. So before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple logistical points. Firstly, this webinar is recorded, and we will post a recording on both the Fueling Collaboration and the Northern Research Station's websites. It might take us a week or two to get those out, those recordings ready, but they will be up. Closed captioning is available, and if that is needed, there is a C at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that for closed captioning. This discussion is approved for 1.5 Category 1 CFEs through the Society of American Foresters. And if you are seeking those continuing education credits, we will be using the participant list to submit to SAF. So just ask that you make sure that your name is correct in the participant list. If you need to change that, just find your name in that list. And there should be 3 little dots next to your name. You can click those 3 dots and select rename. And then you can make sure you have your full first and last name in there. Again, this is what we'll be using to submit to SAF. Last item I'll mention is that we did receive a lot of pre-submitted questions, but we do have the chat window open, and we encourage active dialogue and participation in that chat. And while the discussion for today is built primarily around those questions that were submitted in advance, please feel free to add any additional questions or comments, and we'll do our best to incorporate those also into our discussion today. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment. I'm sorry. First, our discussion today will be focused on the future is Smoky. So with increasing wildfire activity due to changes in climate, smoke is likely to become more prevalent and continue to influence society. So we have a group of panelists today that are going to explore how we can address and adapt to a smoky future. But before we get started, I wanted to take a minute just to acknowledge all of the organizers within Fueling Collaboration. So all of the names and faces that you're seeing here have contributed their expertise and knowledge to building this panel discussion series. And this group is just a pleasure to work with. And I really appreciate everyone putting forth their time into making this series a success. So our panel discussion today will be hosted by Eric Evanson, and he will introduce our panelists. But before we jump into that, just wanted to call folks' attention to our future discussions. In January, we will have a discussion focused on the phenology of fire, listening to the plants and animals. And then in February, we will finish off this season's discussions with a topic on successfully bridging the gap, Eastern U.S. models of fire science and management collaboration. Finally, if you missed our first discussion in this series, which happened last month, the recording is available and is up on the web. And that topic was on fire history as a bridge between ecological knowledge systems. So I just encourage you, if you missed that one, to check out either Fueling Collaboration or the Northern Research Station's website for that recording. So at that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Eric Evanson with the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange Network, who will be moderating today's discussion and introducing our panelists. So Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Andrea. Again, my name is Eric Evanson. I'm with the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, and my role is the Science Communications Specialist. I've been with the group for the last, since June, but prior to that, I spent 33 years as a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and for just over 2 decades, I was actually an incident meteorologist, or IMET, providing on-site weather support at large wildfires across the entire country. And so I've definitely seen my fair share of smoke in my meteorological career. And when the Fueling Collaboration team got together to talk about what kind of topics we wanted to address this year, smoke was definitely one that really stuck out based on our experiences in the upper Midwest and in the eastern United States, where smoke was way more prevalent than it has been. And the one thing I kind of was sticking in my mind after this year of smoke that we've experienced is that smoke is no longer a novelty anymore. I currently reside in Burlington, Vermont, and a lot of times, you would go outside and you'd see the kind of a hazy sky, and then you'd find out it was, smoke from either the Western United States wildfires or maybe Western Canada. But this year was different. The upper Midwest and the Eastern United States saw way more smoke than they have. Essentially, all of Canada was burning this year. And the other unique thing was the fact that it was burning outside of the peak fire, what is their peak fire season. And so we saw way more smoke than we normally do. And we also saw the frequency and the amount being very significant than what the upper Midwest and the Eastern United States has seen in the past. And that obviously then ties in with the idea that air quality was affected. And we definitely saw some days where the air quality was an issue with the amount of smoke in the air. This summer we started seeing pictures from New York City, from Washington, D.C., from Chicago in like late June, where you'd see these orange to red skies with dense smoke, visibilities under 3 miles and probably even under a mile in some locations. And obviously that smoke having some sort of health and safety impact as well. And the one kind of interesting thing is, one night my wife said, "What's this AQI on my phone?" On her smartphone, she started seeing values of AQI. So the air quality index of 180. But the question is, what is What does that mean? 180, 75, 400. So it's just this idea that smoke is becoming more prevalent to the point of it now needs to be addressed. And I think that rolls then into this whole idea of like communication and getting information out to the public and fire practitioners about smoke and the impacts that it is having. You know, we already have tools out there to predict where the smoke is, where it's going, the potential amount and impact that it might have. We're also starting to see, as I mentioned, you know, just the communications of smoke increasing, the air quality, the monitoring of it increasing because of smoke. And I know in my last 8 or 10 years as an IMET, you know, that to address this idea of smoke becoming more prevalent, I know when I would go out on wildfires, more and more times, there would be an air resource advisor. I don't know if many of you know what an air resource advisor is. We're going to talk a little bit about that here today, but air resource advisor is there to provide air quality and smoke information to the public and to the fire crews as well. So smoke just becoming more and more prevalent, that needs to be addressed with respect to us communicating information about it. The other thing is we don't hear about fire season anymore, because in some parts of the country it's year round, and you've got year round fire, you've got year round smoke, and you've got the impacts associated with smoke. And obviously, you know, it's getting warmer and drier. The climate is changing. That could lead to more wildfires, and again, to lead to more smoke. So what the most exciting part for me today is the fact that we've got an incredibly knowledgeable group of folks on this panel who are going to talk about smoke and its impacts and how we address and adapt to a smoky future. So before I bring them on to introduce them, I just kind of want to mention a couple of things. Part of our discussion today is going to be operational. We're not going to have any slides that show different tools and resources. However, on the Fueling Collaboration, the Future is Smoky webpage, we've added a whole bunch of resources and links for you to be able to peruse through after our discussion today. And then feel free, if you come across any relevant links related to smoke and air quality and impacts, feel free to throw those in the chat, and then I'll get those on the Future Smoky webpage for you to be able to reference at a future time. And then lastly, as Andrea had mentioned, our group went through all the questions, and we kind of formulated our topics around all of the excellent questions you folks had sent to us when you registered for today's panel discussion. So we greatly appreciate that, and that helped formulate the ideas. And while we may not necessarily speak to every single individual one, I think you're going to find that our general conversations will likely address a lot of the questions that you folks had posed. So again, thank you with that. So what I would like to do right now is go ahead and bring our panelists here and do some introductions today for our panel. We have Dr. Megan Johnson, we have Dr. Jay Charney, we have Trent Wickman, and we also have Dr. Scott Goodrick with us today for the Future Smoky panel discussion. So what I'd like to do right now is let's go ahead and start with Dr. Megan Johnson. And Megan, if you'd like to introduce yourself, share a little bit about your background, and if you have any kind of opening thoughts about the Future is Smoky, feel free.
Hi, thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan, and I am currently a postdoc working with the Forest Service through the ORISE program, which is the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. And my background is largely in kind of smoke modeling. As a PhD student at North Carolina State University, working with Fernando Garcia Menendez, I got to explore a lot of questions at the interface of air quality and land management, thinking about why we care about smoke and from a health and human public perceptions perspective, but also what that means in terms of why it's in the air and why we need to figure out a better way to exist with it. And so that got me into thinking about a lot of the tools that are available, some of the more complex models that we have available, but also the people on the ground, either working with fire or experiencing the smoke, trying to bring together a big picture view of that. And I'm just excited to be here today. And, one of the big parts of my work too is looking at the future. And, being a student in the Southeast, that meant more maybe of a focus on what the future of smoke and fire looks like in the Southeast. But I think there's a lot of interesting things we're going to talk about today that are going to apply to a lot of different regions. So thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right, thank you, Megan. Let's go ahead and go over to Dr. Scott Goodrick.
Thanks, Eric. Name is Scott Goodrick. I'm a research meteorologist with the U.S. Forest Service, Southern Research Station, located in Athens, Georgia, where I served as the director for the station's Center for Forest Health and Disturbance. The majority of my research revolves around prescribed fire, pretty much all aspects of it relating from fire behavior on through to smoke management. I've been with the Forest Service working in this capacity for just over 20 years. Prior to that, I was with at the time it was called the Florida Division of Forestry. Now it's the Florida Forest Service. I had a name change in there where I worked with them developing their fire management information system, working to integrate some smoke management tools into their prescribed fire authorization process, develop their general fire weather program. Really didn't need much more of a reason to have this kind of meeting than what happened this summer with all the smoke in the Northeast. It's kind of the type of event that makes kind of shines a spotlight on this work area, the area of smoke management and the trade-offs between prescribed fire and wildfire. So it's it's one of those things that you hate that it happens, but it's kind of good for business. So just excited to be part of this and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. Let's go ahead over to Dr. Jay Charney.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Charney. I'm a research meteorologist with the Northern Research Station, sitting here in sunny East Lansing, Michigan today. Historically, I am a meteorological modeler by trade, if you will, going back to the early 90s in grad school. And so I spent a lot of years working with the forecast models that drive or underpin the day-to-day weather forecasts that we see every day that have been steadily improving for years and years. I mean, people say meteorologists get to be wrong 50% of the time and keep their job, but it's shading better and better. There's no question over the course of my career arc. Joined the Forest Service in 2001, so working on 22 years here. And my research focus has been on fire weather and how weather affects both fire activity from fire behavior and fire size, and fire danger, and then where does the smoke go from these fires? And been studying both wildfires and prescribed fires over the years, and working on sort of developing and refining the models that are coming into more and more regular day-to-day use for saying how smoky is it going to be due to any given fire. And I'll leave it there, but well, maybe one more point. I mean, as Scott already said, we had a big event this year that affected the north central and northeast United States in a way that we seldom get affected by smoke. And this really has brought a lot of the public side of this to the forefront on my desk, and I think on all of our desks, and will continue to do so going forward. So I think there's lots of things to talk about as far as how we can do our jobs as land management personnel. That's very useful, but also thinking about how we communicate this and how we access the information and communicate that information to the public, and also how reliable it is, I think is a very important thing to consider. So anyway, this time I really will leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate that. And then let's head on over to Trent Wickman.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's an honor to be part of this panel and have an opportunity to speak to you all. So I'm Trent Wickman. I'm located in Duluth, Minnesota, with the Forest Service, Eastern Region. My career started with the State Air Regulatory Agency in Minnesota doing industrial permitting for 5 years until 2001 when I came over to the Forest Service. My job is pretty much the same as it's was in 2001 is about half my job deals with industrial air quality impacts and assessing those to the forest resources in the upper Midwest here, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And the other half deals with fire and everything, all kinds of smoke management activities, from training to actually in the trenches doing forecasting. And so I'm a user of the models that the other folks work to provide. You know, in addition to doing that for prescribed burning, I also, starting in 2014, started going out as an air resource advisor, which was mentioned before, working on wildfires, preliminary, primarily in the West, but also in the Southeast. So yeah, I think that's probably enough for intro. One thing I wanted to say before, just since it doesn't sort of fit perfectly in with what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about more specifics on smoke management and issues like that. But I just want to say that in regards to what Jay said about the significance of the smoke in the last few years, you know, for my part of the country, 2021 was the first year where we got some really significant smoke, widespread smoke across the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan. And the one thing that really caught my interest, and I think is an opportunity for everybody, even if you're not in the smoke management game, is that these smoke impacts give us an opportunity to talk about fire in a way that no one's really been interested before. It was just shock to me with a lot of the conversations we had in Minnesota regarding the smoke impacts, which at the time were primarily from Canada, although we ended up having a significant fire in northern Minnesota. But a lot of people that just, you know, aren't generally outside type people or whatever, had no idea of fire, would say, you know, the smoke's a real pain. Why don't they just go put the dang fires out? So when you have people saying that, there's a huge misunderstanding of how fire even works. And what's the difference between prescribed fire and wildfire? How do we fight fires? So this is just basic information that people in the East, and I would say probably the north part of the East, because my impression of being down south is people understand prescribed fire down there. But we have some education to do, not only with smoke, but just with how fire works. So I just wanted to throw that out there too. But thanks for having me.
All right, thank you very much, Trent. And we're actually going to stay with you because that's a perfect segue into our first topic about this idea of the current state of smoke modeling. And all of you have experience with that. But, you know, Trent, you're doing smoke forecast and information related to smoke, both at the prescribed burn level and on large wildfires. And I was just wondering if you could start the conversation by speaking to kind of the current tools and resources that are out there, some of the things you use, or what works, what doesn't work when you're providing this smoke information to the fire practitioners.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's interesting because I think back to 2001 when, you know, I teach smoke management and RX 410, and we would talk about at the start of class, it was always a nightmare because we'd have to try to download these pieces of software on people's computers so they could do modeling. And now everything is served up on the internet. And, you know, we've gone such a long ways. And as was mentioned, I mean, you know, the science gets better. And so, but one thing that's always been at play, which is always a question that comes up, is people will ask, well, what's the right model? Like, that's the major thing you need to know. Like, what's the magic right model that I need to pick so that I'm doing it right? And to me, it's not so much about the model. The model is just a tool. And, you know, there's the famous saying is all models are wrong, some are useful. I like that. So, you know, models are just one piece of information. And so I don't want people to get too hung up on it, but we have, in my view, great tools right now to use, not only for operational day of modeling smoke forecasts, but even for planning. I kind of split it into planning stage. You know, you're a year or more ahead of time and you're trying to look at smoke impacts versus, and so you don't know the meteorology, you're going to have to kind of parameterize it, versus day of or day before, or maybe 2 days before. You know, that's kind of a different animal. But we have great tools. You know, we have screening tools that you can run in about 30 seconds. Doesn't take much input. Obviously, if you don't have much input, then your error bars are bigger, but maybe at that point it's okay because you're just kind of in a screening mode. We have tools like vSmoke Web, more sophisticated tools like PB Piedmont. I don't use that as much, but I use Blue Sky Playground for day of, and obviously that's what we use as air resource advisors too. I mean, those are great tools. So you can dig into what are the pluses and minuses of some tools. Some people will talk about HRR. And, you know, when you're looking at other tools, it's good to be able to understand what are the differences. For example, in HRR, how do they deal with fire growth? Or are they just picking up fire detects and running them forward in time? If that's the case, then how good is that for forecasting something beyond just the immediate now? So these are the kind of things you need to think of. But again, it's not so much a matter of just picking a model. It's understanding what the model gives you and then being able to pull in additional information in your experience. Your experience is a lot because you can look at model results. And if you don't have the experience, you can't give it that kind of QA check to go, does that seem right? That seem right question always needs to be there. So I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay. And I know, Trent, you've been using a lot of that information more in the upper Midwest. Let's go over to Scott. What are your thoughts on some of the current tools there, perhaps like in the Southeast?
Yeah, well, I mean, Trent gave a great overview, and a lot of those tools are the same tools that we use, you know, down here in the Southeast. You know, a little bit of background on some of these tools is a lot of the work in atmospheric transport and dispersion kind of comes from two different routes. One being the, you know, regulatory of point source emissions, and that was where a lot of our work on, you know, simple Gaussian plumes originated, and a lot of our understanding for that kind of source. And the other real route was a lot of stuff dealing with weapons of mass destruction, nuclear type explosions, and the subsequent transport for that. So how well these tools work for fire depends on how well your fire looks like an industrial stack source or a nuclear weapon. And so it's really been a lot of work on refining how the fire gets represented, because a lot of the atmospheric processes, once you start getting away from the actual source, start to look the same. But how do we characterize the heat release into the atmosphere? Is it done all in one location? Is it treated as a point source in the model, or is it varying with time? You know, Trent kind of mentioned that when you look in the HRR models, smoke products, how are they putting in the smoke is going to determine how useful it is. And again, it is a tool. They're making assumptions. It's going to be useful for some things and not necessarily others. You know, probably in this whole discussion, we're going to hear the phrase, well, it depends a lot. And that comes up a lot when you're dealing with smoke, because, you know, there's a whole range of scales that we have to deal with when we're dealing with the fire and smoke problem. And not all tools are adapted to all scales. So they have to make different assumptions, which, depending on the question you're trying to ask, may be good assumptions or bad assumptions. You know, so if you're asking the question of where my smoke is going to go at night, and is it going to cross a roadway and cause a potential vehicle accident, that's a very different scale than if you're saying, is my smoke going to be transported a long way and lead to an air quality exceedance in, you know, in our case here in Atlanta? You know, so those are very different scales of questions, and the tools to answer them would, of necessity at this point, be very different.
All right, thank you, Scott. Megan, I wanted to mention at one of your talks, I believe you had done some work with models dealing with prescribed burning and kind of like different inputs with changing climate. Somebody had asked a question about, are we incorporating those types of changes into some of our modeling, and didn't know if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure, yeah. And I guess before I dive too far into that, I think it's important to make the distinction based on what Trent and Scott were just talking about, which was a little more focused on these kind of planning tools, right? Versus thinking about climate change and impacts on smoke, maybe more long-term. And so my experience with that is using maybe more of a, less of a planning tool model, more of a full science, chemistry, physics model, and thinking about how climate might impact or change fire activity. And so from the prescribed fire side, you know, there's a lot of questions that surround that. Nobody's projecting how how the actual activity will change. You know, we're understanding how the temperature and the winds might change and how that might affect what days are good for burning in the future. And so again, this comes back to a lot of assumptions and a lot of questions you have to ask in terms of what might change in terms of burning activity in a region. And so part of the way we tried to address that is asking folks in the Southeast how they might change their burning activities if they are maybe facing fewer days to burn. Are they just going to burn less? Are they going to try to compress their burning? All those kinds of changes that could happen could change how much smoke is released and when. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of different questions about that, but there are definitely ways to try and make some assumptions, make some best estimates in terms of how those changes might happen and what that means for smoke across a broader region. You know, that there's just, I think like Trent said, we're gonna keep going back to like all models are wrong, but there's going to be some useful insights and answers we can get out of some of them. And so thinking about climate change and modeling that into the future is a big piece of fire in general right now, and how we can kind of, we're going to touch on this later, you know, get into that trade-off of wildfire versus prescribed fire. So there's definitely ways to think about it, definitely ways to input it. I can't speak necessarily to the tool side of getting it on the ground and thinking about climate change right away, but there's a lot of people thinking about that for sure.
Excellent, thank you. And that kind of, I wanted to use that as kind of a segue into some of the stuff that like Jay is working on. We talked a little bit about the current tools that are out there, the current thinking, or how we're handling smoke and smoke management. But, you know, Jay, you led off earlier too with this idea of how satisfied are people with the current quality, reliability, accessibility of like smoke forecast information. So if you have any thoughts on kind of the current state of the tools that are there for smoke management, air quality, but also would love to have you speak on what does the future look like? What are the things being worked on that might help address any potential gaps of what's out there now versus what might be needed in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first point that I would like to make and circle back to something Trent said that I think is a very valuable and valid point is that depending on what question you're asking from the models, you frequently will use different models and for different reasons. If you're in a planning stage where you're sort of maybe considering potential situations or gaming out situations of what could happen on a fire with respect to smoke at some point in the future, you use a certain type of model and a certain type of decision making and inputs and outputs. Comparing this to if you're trying to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, the next day, or the few days after that, that's a very different sort of headspace and decision space. And different models are better at that sort of thing than others. And there's kind of been a thread throughout all of these discussions we've had so far about the models. And Scott sort of mentions about where they came from, who developed them, and for what purpose. And historically, I mean, going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, when many of these concepts started to become part of our science-based decision-making, let's say, we lived in a very data-poor environment. We didn't have forecast models. We didn't have detailed weather information necessarily. So we had a lot of models that were designed to fill in gaps between what we had and what we didn't know. Well, as we get more and more information, some of those models are better able to take advantage of that more detailed information than others. Some of them will actually degrade more detailed information and perhaps give you a worse answer with the more with the larger amount of data points than you would have gotten from the simpler data. And trying to understand that is very, very complicated. Which tools still work, which don't? Which tools will continue to get better as weather forecasts improve? That's a very complicated, it's very much a research question. And as an R&D scientist, that's very much the sort of thing that I think about all the time. Tools that are based on a statistical analysis from a certain number, even a handful of fires in the 70s, that come up with, here's what this number means. that's not the same as a full physics-based analysis of all of the physical processes, force equals mass times acceleration, and molecular processes of heat release from fires and smoke generation, putting that into a model and then tracking all of those particles and smoke forward in time. That's a very different beast. And understanding those differences is important for us as research scientists, but it's increasingly important for us to be able to communicate those sorts of differences to the practitioners and to the public. And that's where, to segue to the specific question you asked, Eric, and even the question that I posed leading into this, we were starting to organize and starting to talk about this panel just as the smoke situation was starting to ease off, let's say, in the summer, late summer and early fall in this part of the country. And there were a lot of discussion about the air quality index and the Air Now webpage and the accessibility of information, but also what do these maps showing smoke moving across the landscape and what it's going to look like for the next couple of days, coming from the high resolution rapid refresh, the HRRR, HRR smoke, those sorts of things. How reliable are those? Can they tell us the difference between, is it going to be a day where maybe I'll smell a little bit of smoke, or is it going to be a day where I'm going to have real respiratory distress? And how do people plan their days around that sort of information? Very much an active research question and a very complex communication question. And that's kind of why I posed that question for the panel and arguably for this group. I'd be very interested in any discussions from anyone in the broad audience here going forward, not right now because it's just the 5 of us, but going forward about their perceptions of how good are these forecasts. If they said tomorrow was going to be a bad day, was it a bad day? Or was that good enough for people to plan? And I would be very interested in Scott's and Trent's and Megan's thoughts about that as well.
If any of you like to respond, feel free.
This may not be a direct response to Jay's kind of overarching question, but I think something that we've all kind of circled around in this part of the discussion is kind of this distinction of the models and the tools that are available. And one thing that I felt like maybe I missed in my point earlier is that, you know, there's a lot of attention on these models right now, and there's been a lot of work to improve, especially the bigger kind of more chemistry and physics based models like Jay was just touching on, that are used for different purposes than planning and smoke and fire on the ground, smoke management concerns while you're burning. And I think that's one gap in my mind where, you know, we're thinking more about the advancing some of these bigger, more researchy based models rather than applying some more improvements that might be useful for folks that are planning on the ground. Just something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I felt like maybe that tied together a lot of what we've been saying in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, you know, my mind goes in a lot of directions when the question that Jay posed, and one direction is again back to operational side, kind of where I live a lot, and you know, people will say, well, how good are the models? And it's like, this is the first, it depends. Like what question are you asking? Like, how good is the model prediction at a certain point on the map? Or how good is it at least pointing the plume in the right direction? You know, those kind of questions, you know, you get different answers. You know, I do say that over the years, I've become more and more comfortable with Blue Sky Playground. I mean, I remember multiple times where I'll be either on a wildfire or prescribed fire, and I'll get a good satellite view of the plume or maybe even Weather Service radar and overlay it on the prediction, and they match up perfectly. And sometimes that makes me a little afraid because I'm like, you can get the right answer for the wrong reasons too. But I like to pump up the Blue Sky people, so I send them a picture and I send it to them. So I don't know. I'm getting fairly confident with those models, but you can never hang your hat on anything. But I would say that anyways, and that's dealing with even complex meteorology. Now, I don't work in a lot of terrain, but we have some pretty wicked lake effect stuff going on, and it even does a fairly decent job on that, I think. So.
And that's an excellent point, Trent. Just to kind of wrap up this particular topic, I think back to my days in the Weather Service. I started in 1989. Severe weather was actually my passion before fire weather, and just where the models were and where the data and information was back in the late 80s to where it is now and what we can see. Yeah, is it perfect all the time? No, but can you see things that you weren't able to see on such a smaller scale when it came to severe thunderstorms, tornadoes? Those same ideas apply with fire weather, talking about smoke plumes and smoke dispersion and stuff. And so I think just stepping back in the bigger picture, from where it used to be when I first started to where it is today, there's been a lot of progress made to where we can start to see things. And clearly, there's the need to continue to improve these tools as well, based on what's happening with these fire seasons as of late. So. All right, let's go ahead and transition over into our second topic. We've talked about the smoke modeling and then the tools, but now let's talk a little bit about air quality and smoke impacts. And I'm going to kind of throw it over to Megan to kind of lead up the start of this particular topic.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, like I said, a lot of my background is really focused on the air quality piece of it, and just kind of taking a step back into why we're even here talking about smoke and air quality is because the Clean Air Act, which is, something that we luckily came into back in the 70s, is working. A lot of the other air pollution sources that may have degraded air quality otherwise are being controlled, and they're reducing. We've got great downward trend lines. And so we're seeing more and more of this impact from smoke on air quality. And you can see where there's this difference in the downward trend in overall air pollution, but an upward spike in pollution from fire. And that's a big deal. And really, we care about that because it has these impacts on human health. It's also, a safety problem, as we've brought up in kind of the application of some of the tools for planning your smoke management. You don't want smoke causing visibility issues on a roadway or for planes for various reasons, but it really all comes back to human health. We know that the particulate matter, the gases that are released in smoke and other pollution sources are bad for our health. And generally, the size range we care most about, which you may have heard quite a bit that gets thrown around, it's called PM 2.5, and that's related to the approximate diameter of these particles, which is really small, smaller than your hair by a fair amount. And that just means that it can get deeper into your lungs and cause more problems. And that's why we really care about it. Not that anything else doesn't cause issues, but that is the leading kind of one that we care about. And I think a lot of what it comes back to when we think about air quality is how we're quantifying this. And that's a lot of what we've just talked about in terms of modeling. Modeling is a huge piece of that for smoke because it's so difficult otherwise to kind of isolate these impacts from smoke. And so you can look at monitors, but that's not going to tell you what's exactly just smoke. You can look at satellites, but that gives us a good idea of where the smoke is going. There's a lot of issues in trying to back out what's just from smoke, how to quantify that. And then you got clouds and a lot of other issues that come into play there. So there's so many ways to try and answer the question about smoke and air quality. But models are really a great tool for that. But yet again, just a tool. So, like I said, in the beginning of all this, and there's so much regional importance when we think about smoke. And like we've discussed, the kind of big event this year was a big surprise for the Northeast, and down into DC and even into some of the Southeast. We're getting smoke more frequently in wildfire prone areas, but we're getting more smoke in areas that haven't seen it at that concentration in a while. So there's a lot of questions about wildfire versus prescribed fire. And again, I know we're going to come into that maybe a little bit more specifically later, but we're going to keep circling around it until we get there too. So thinking about how much those different types of fires impact air quality is a really big deal. And that's something that we're all trying to answer in a lot of different ways. So that may have been a little bit rambly, but that's where I'm coming at when it comes to air quality and smoke.
All right. Scott, do you have any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, as Megan pointed out, the Clean Air Act has been working, and it's led to the reduction in, a lot of our industrial pollutants, and it's raising, smoke is now becoming one of the next things on the radar. And we've been seeing that a lot in the Southeast, that there's now a lot of concern about changes in air quality standards impacting our ability to get the prescribed burning that we've, always done accomplished. Are these air quality regulations going to lead to a reduction in our available burn days? And it gets rather complicated to figure out, since some of these changes are about, annual standards, which, when you start looking at changes to the annual standard, our little fire events may just be making a small air quality change, and we're not exceeding the daily limit, but they might add up over the course of a year to an exceedance on the annual level. Well, so we may not exceed it on any particular day necessarily, but our burning could nudge us over at the annual level, some of the proposed changes that are being discussed. So that there is a lot of concern about this. And, the Southeast is, as has been mentioned, has had prescribed fire, has been a very prominent tool in our forest management toolkit for a very long time. We average between 6 and 8 million acres in the Southeast per year in prescribed fire, with, some states, in some years accounting for almost a third of that, with, Florida burns almost 2 million acres a year. So they're very concerned about how these air quality pieces are going to impact their ability to do it, and understanding the trade-offs between prescribed fire and wildfire. I heard the term at another meeting of building up, with our practices of fire exclusion, we've built up this smoke debt, that there's all this fuel that's accumulated over time that's waiting to be released in a fire and relieve that smoke debt. And as kind of an example of that, we had here in the Southeast back in 2007, we had fires in the Okefenokee wildlife refuge that consumed massive quantities of organic soil material, very similar to what was going on up in Canada this past summer. And those wildfires caused air quality problems as far south as Naples, Florida, as far west as Memphis, Tennessee, and as far north as Washington, D.C., over the course of the roughly 2.5 to 3 months that those fires burned. So there's some big trade-offs that need to be made. We're going to experience the smoke at some point, one way or another.
Excellent point there, Scott. So with the idea of air quality and smoke impacts and health, all that, I was wondering, Trent, if you could speak a little bit to, in case people don't know, what are some of the things when you go out to a wildfire as an air resource advisor, what type of information are you providing folks related to air quality and smoke?
Well, first of all, is find out who the public information officer is on the fire, because we work together really closely in getting that message out. And really, it all revolves around, the core message of the young, the old, and those with cardiovascular and respiratory problems. We try to focus all information around that. Focus on where those people are and getting the message to those people. And then obviously making use of the air quality index and those rainbow colors, which are very easily understood. You know, but a wildfire is different, obviously, from a prescribed fire. Wildfire is more of an emergency situation, and you don't have a lot of time for planning. You basically have to rely on what's already set up from previous, you know, whatever people have done in the area previously. You know, when you're in a prescribed burn setting, you have more of an opportunity to develop a message and get people kind of geared up to understand what you're talking about. Yeah, that's what I would say for that.
And you're going to like community meetings, like in situations. I've been on wildfires where areas where the smoke has just been trapped for days. And so are you also going to like community meetings to address the public on the smoke impacts and the health and safety?
Yeah, depending on what the information officers need, you can do all sorts of different kind of outreach. It could be public meetings, social media, you know, you name it. You get the word out in lots of different ways, but yeah, all of that.
Okay, thanks. Jay, do you have any thoughts on air quality or smoke impacts?
I do, and maybe I'll help us transition toward the next topic a little bit, because as you can see, you get four of us together, we could talk for hours and hours and hours about this, so we don't want to get too far off track. But sort of the idea of trade-offs between prescribed fire and wildfire for smoke impacts is a very tricky conversation to have. And we've touched upon a little bit of this already. But as Scott has said, that millions of acres have been burned every year in the Southeast for decades. Most of that wasn't because if they didn't burn, there would be larger air quality impacts due to wildfires. That's not really the thinking for why one does prescribe fires, particularly in the Southeast, but even in many parts of the country, that's not the thinking. In many parts of the country, it's more how do you control the wildfires? But the idea of trade-offs between prescribed fire smoke and wildfire smoke is a really complex, both socially and physically, scientific question. I mean, you can make the argument that, all smoke is bad. Breathing smoke is almost never a good thing for a person. That's never going to be a positive. But what concentrations constitute bad for different people in different groups is different. It is different depending on whether it's a wildfire or prescribed fire smoke, but also even small, and it's not necessarily a large wildfire issue either. Small wildfires in the wildland urban interface that are burning building materials can have a much larger health impact locally and even in a broader sense than a large wildfire in the wilderness. But there are thresholds for all of those questions. And part of where we might transition our discussion a little bit is, does it make sense now, and will it make sense at some point in the future to start thinking about establishing prescribed fire programs or objectives or targets that can actually affect the air quality situation down the road? Do we have the tools to be able to make that call now? Can we do that anywhere? And should we be trying to do that? Or should we be thinking about this another way? And maybe that's how a way of seeding the discussion into the difference between wildfire and prescribed fire smoke going forward. That's what I would put forth.
Yeah, that's exactly where we were headed, Jay. So I appreciate that. So let's follow up with Scott on that. Let's continue this conversation about the whole idea with smoke from prescribed fire versus wildfire.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jay. You know, the concept of evaluating the trade-offs in smoke between prescribed fire versus a wildfire is really a new area. I mean, it's something that we're starting to be asked about, and how do we consider this? And to be honest, it's about trying to maintain. As I mentioned before, prescribed fire to some level in the Southeast is being threatened as the smoke as a pollutant source rises up on the priority list, because other pollutants are being brought down through different interventions. We need to think about this aspect of what we're doing when we burn intentionally. And one of the big issues of the trade-off is that when we do a prescribed burn, we are choosing the conditions under which the fire is going to burn. So we are going to be managing those emissions to a certain extent by one, choosing the weather conditions we choose to burn under, and choosing the ignition method, how we choose to ignite it, basically picking methods that shift the balance between how much of a burn unit is burning as backing versus heading versus flanking fire is going to change how our fuel consumption occurs. So we have some options to management, but the other big option we have is what wind direction we choose to burn under. Do we choose to burn on the day when the smoke is going to be put into a major metropolitan area? Or do we pick one where it's going to go off in hopefully a much more benign direction? So we have the ability to make some choices, whereas with the wildfire, as Trent mentioned, we're dealing with the hand that we've been dealt. And the smoke's going to go where it's going to go. And we're hoping to be able to use the tools to provide people some information to help them, plan around that. But when we're using the tools on a prescribed fire, it's all about, we're trying to minimize the impact on the people, or, in the communities around where we're intending to burn. So there is that intent piece that allows us to manage that a lot better. And again, try to focus on minimizing the impact. And this also then gets into questions such as environmental justice type questions. Are we picking wind directions that adversely impact certain communities more so than others? What's coming into, the decision process of what wind directions are chosen. By burning under different conditions, we can limit, the amount of emissions. So the downwind impact is going to be reduced. So there are a range of techniques that we can be looking at to try to do something about it and alter that. Basically we're stacking the deck to try to get the fire to do what we need it to do for ecological purposes within the burn unit, but minimize the impact of the smoke downwind.
Excellent. I saw Megan, you nodding your head there in agreement as well. Would you like to provide some thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, probably the biggest nod I had was when Scott started talking about, we choose these wind directions, and we really, as we're thinking about putting this fire on the ground, you got to think about who's downwind, and there's a lot of questions about EJ in terms of air pollution across the board, environmental justice, and we've done a little bit of work looking into who's experiencing smoke in the Southeast from a little bit from an EJ perspective, and there are some possible concerns there, so that's just something we really want to be conscious of and keeping in mind as we start trying to plan for more fire on the ground in the future, potentially, and yeah, I think that was where the biggest nod came from in that.
Got it. Thanks. Trent, do you have any thoughts on the prescribed fire versus wildland fire?
Well, to me, it's like, I always think about it and things that I've contributed, like for NEPA analysis on the federal side. It's like, okay, on a per acre basis, like Scott said, you're going to have, all things being equal, more consumption in a wildfire. So if you got more consumption, you got more smoke. So the trade-offs to me are pretty easy to talk to. So I don't get too hung up on that. I do see that there's some more, I suppose, recent research saying maybe the emission factors are slightly different depending on which one you have. But, in my simple view of the world, wildfires, hot and dry, more consumption, more smoke. The comment on EJ, though, is interesting because it made me think of something. We in Region 9, Jeremy Ash, if he's out there, nod to him, built a front end on the Blue Sky Playground tool so that when we produce smoke outlooks for, the day of a burn, there's a screen on it that he pulled the EJ data from EPA. So we can overlay that on where the plume's going. So not only do we have a population layer too, we have population, but we also have an EJ layer we can put on there. And it's really handy. And, I think people, sometimes when they think EJ, they think inner city only, but when, tribal communities are a big thing that I think gets forgotten about. And so those will pop up a lot on these maps. So yeah, that got me shaking my head. So.
I was wondering some of the questions that had been submitted earlier, if any of you know, is there data on how smoke from the two types of burning compare, like with respect to health or particulates versus wildfire versus prescribed fire?
Scott, you unmuted first, so go ahead.
Oh. Well, I was just going to say that, like Jay said, there is no healthy smoke. All smoke off of wildland fires is unhealthy. If you start throwing in wildland urban interface type fuels where you get some, man-made materials, it gets far worse. But it's all bad. There's varying degrees of bad, but they will all kill you, in sufficient quantities for sufficient period of time. So there isn't a good smoke. We really can't make much argument on the benefits of prescribed fire over wildfire based on the chemical composition of what's coming off of smoke, because like I said, it's all unhealthy. But there are some studies, and there are some trying to look at it and quantify some of the different things. I remember a couple that are focusing on some of the other air toxins such as formaldehyde and its other aldehyde friends that show that yes, when it burns in a wildfire, there is more formaldehyde produced. But again, is the amount going to be significant enough to make the formaldehyde not a problem? No.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, Scott. And I think I was just noticing somebody put in the chat something I've been meaning to bring up and then keep forgetting. But the EPA and the Forest Service work together to try and do kind of a comparison of smoke from wildfire and prescribed fire. And it's a pretty comprehensive review of a lot of the more health-based things that I know a little bit about, but definitely not everything. And so, I mean, there's a big part of that in there is how we're getting this, either the chemical composition or making our understanding how smoke is impacting health. And I think, a lot of that is people are trying to look at these fire sources more specifically. There's definitely more studies looking at how wildfire smoke is potentially impacting health versus prescribed fire. They're minimal. And I think the ones that do exist are folks on the front line. And so, but I mean, so people are asking these questions, but what we're seeing so far is that, it's not that different in terms of the actual smoke composition and size and things like that. So that's just wanted to put that out there. People are trying to nail down whether they're these differences. And a lot of our assumptions initially were based on, ambient air pollution in general, not trying to look at the source more specifically. And we're also, again, seeing there that it's not necessarily that different between wildfire smoke specifically and larger air pollution in terms of health impact.
Yeah, I think part of the trade-off that really needs to be examined that hasn't been is we've spent a lot of time looking at a comparison of a prescribed fire event versus a wildfire event.
Yes.
But not necessarily, okay, in this ecosystem, we have a 3 to 5 year fire return interval. So for that system, you're getting an input of smoke every 3 to 5 years versus the episodic wildfire event. So what are the trade-offs between the potential, very high dosage wildfire event, the acute event, versus the more longer term chronic exposure at a lower dosage level. That's one of the areas that's very current research area, is looking at that type of trade-off, where what's the effect of the accumulated but lower dosage of prescribed burn smoke.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a huge question, and definitely over my head. I'm waiting for somebody else to do that work.
You and me both.
And
Well,
I think,
I would,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, I was just going to throw out that, you know, there's been some recent work on firefighter exposure, which is becoming super, super popular in the RX 410 class. And they look at both prescribed and wildfire, and yeah, you don't, fire's fire, smoke is smoke.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm trying to move away more from the health side, where it gets muddier and muddier for me. But I just kind of trying to, like Scott said, a lot of what kind of these quantifications are when looking at these individual events versus each other, and that gets really tricky. And I know at least something we tried to do when I was a student is look at kind of at least a total year impact of smoke from prescribed fire versus wildfire. In the Southeast, it's easier to say this is more typical for prescribed fire because the pattern, at least across the region, doesn't change too much. But, you know, when you try to compare on that year-to-year basis with wildfire, it gets a little bit trickier. But just to plug to that, it's not published, but, you know, looking at that, there's much more of a, like I said, more usual and consistent impact year to year from prescribed fire. But even with a small number of wildfires in the Southeast, locally, you know, that's going to be a much larger impact. And so trying to be able to quantify those differences across scales and times is really important. And I think we have to be able to be very clear about that when we're talking about how we're comparing these smoke impacts. If that was clear.
Excellent. Thank you. That was a great discussion. We do need to transition into our last topic here based on time, because I know we've got some stuff we want to talk about in this one, and that's kind of communications. And we've talked a lot today about different aspects, but now I think there were a couple of questions that were submitted to us that I think really will help us in this next topic, because I think these are important. One of the questions was, when discussing the difference between prescribed fire and wildfire smoke with community members, what do you think are the most important aspects to highlight? What have you found to be the best methods for doing community outreach about smoke? And the other one, just kind of a more general one, if any of the folks on the panel have had particular success in pulling various groups to the table, whether it be wildfire management, public health, environmental folks for air quality and related to air quality. And so are there any kind of success stories out there with respect to communications and how we can address these particular topics that we've been talking about? So I think, Scott, you had said you had a story. I believe, Trent, you might have had one. So if you want to kind of start us off, Scott, we can continue down this communication path.
Yeah, one of the this was from my time with the Florida Forest Service. Hard for me to call them that. Was, you know, as I mentioned earlier, prescribed fire. Florida is one of the biggest states for prescribed fire, and part of how they're able to accomplish that is through a lot of training, communication, and education. They have, at least when I was there, they did this prescribed fire media days, where they invited the media, members of the media, to come out and actively participate in a prescribed fire. See the level of planning that goes into the fire, into the execution of the fire, and all the different aspects, and get fully educated and immersed. And then you basically are creating a pool of advocates that understand what's going on. And the next time prescribed fire comes up on the news or a smoke event is happening, they can talk about it more intelligently. They went so far as that they have a program called Prescribed Fire in Florida's Ecosystems, which is an educational program geared at elementary, middle school, and into high schools. So they are teaching about smoke. They make resources available to teachers to discuss this and how the role of fire in the natural environment of Florida is part of their ecosystem. And, it's a continuous process to maintain this. There is no one and done magic bullet that you can go, and this is how we're going to get them on board. And to me, this is one of the advantages of prescribed fire, is you can build relationships over time. You're planning an event that's going to happen some period down the road. You can start communicating with people ahead of time. An underutilized aspect of at least the prescribed fire certification process that Florida went through for their burners was the communication part. We spent a lot of time talking about how you start engaging your neighbors and other landowners, engaging the media, different groups. It's all about starting dialogues and building relationships. And that's still a big part of the different prescribed fire groups across the country, is providing ways of building that communication. There are networks across each state for learning about prescribed fire and communicating more about it. So those have been one of the most useful tools.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love the idea of pulling in these groups to help, visually understand what's going on.
We even more recently did it with the Center for Disease Control, taking some of the people who we wanted to work with on some of these smoke and public health issues. We took them out on a prescribed burn and had them again get educated in what the process is and why it's being done and what the value to the ecosystem is, to transform their thinking from smoke as just a toxin to, well, the fire that's causing it is also serving a purpose that's of value to people as well as the ecosystem. So that trying to express those values is a key piece and get people to understand them. And it's all comes down to communication.
How about you, Trent, with your work with fire practitioners and on the smoke and smoke management level? Any stories or thoughts to share?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of war stories, but I think, tagging on to what Scott said, I mean, I hope everybody knows, that's the golden nugget of everything that we talk about today is if people support your burn and why you're burning, they're a lot more amenable to dealing with smoke. That's just the bottom line. And to the degree that you can do that and get them behind you, it's going to make your life so much easier. And I know that takes work. And I know a lot of people that went to work in the woods did so because they don't like to talk to people. But hey, this is the real world we live in. And if you can do that, there's lots of ways to do that proactively. But one story I have, it's a reactive way to do it. It was we sent smoke into a city that we were trying to avoid. And, basically, I shot a picture of the smoke plume going over the city to the public information officer and said, hey, look, what do we do? And this is one of those things where you should actually, we talk about contingency planning for escape fires. You need to have contingency planning for smoke. Because when you get that call at 4:30 in the afternoon, you don't have a lot of time to figure out who you're going to call. Is it, you got a city of 100,000, who are you going to call? The media, the emergency management, the hospitals? I don't know. But what was really cool, the outcome of this is that the PAO did a really good job on the forest of quickly flipping out some social media items and talking about, here's the smoke. Yeah. But as Scott said, the smoke came from this fire over here. And the reason we're doing this fire is because we're doing super cool stuff. We're restoring a savanna that's a rare and endangered kind of habitat that there really isn't many around. And so this is why we're doing that. And, this is all the things we do with the smoke normally. And this is the reason why the smoke is there. But it really became an advertisement for our burning. And I've always said to people in my classes is own your smoke. People try to hide the smoke and don't want people to see the smoke. Own your smoke. That's your calling card. Imagine it as like a plane hauling one of those big, strip things behind it, and take advantage of that and talk about your burn and talk about the cool stuff that you're doing. Like I say, we turned that into a positive, and we got some really good media coverage from that wasn't negative. Luckily the smoke didn't really do much either, so that helped. But other than that, everybody saw it. And the last thing I would say is another way is in this part of the country, burning generates good blueberry picking. And so over time, we found that people will come and want to know not, about the fire, but more because they want to know where the berries are going to be good, like 2 years from now or 3 years. So they're putting out pictures of, because this is a spot where we go back and burn over and over. Here's the fire history, here's the burn history, and here's, where you can go blueberry picking. So building the goodwill, it's great. It works out good.
Eric, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I love what Trent and Scott said about communication. And another thing that, again, because smoke is becoming more prevalent, we talk about fire adapted communities and fire ready communities. Well, there's a whole bunch of resources and tools related to smoke ready. And so we have those on our website as well. So there's definitely communication tools that are being generated as well. I wonder, Jay, do you, with respect to communication and smoke, do you have anything for us?
I do, yeah. So part of my thinking as listening to this discussion has been really insightful, I think, but also watching some of the comments that are going across without digging too deep into them is it's pretty easy to fall into, not a trap, at least a mental thought process of prescribed fire good, wildfire bad. Well, not all prescribed fires are good for everyone, and not all wildfires are bad for everyone. There's a range of outcomes that happen depending on where they're happening, when they're happening, and how they're being managed that affect all of this. And I mean, even things like the wildfire crisis strategy, suggestion that we got to do something about these wildfires, they're bad. But if you dig into the details of some of those strategies, you come away with the idea that the only tool that really scales up in a fiscally reasonable way is prescribed fire. We're putting a lot more fire on the landscape to try to help address our wildfire management problems and difficulties. And that leads directly into, you're going to be putting more fire on the ground more times of the year and more locations where people haven't seen it before. Communication is huge in that. But I think it's important to have the messaging around why that prescribed fire is happening, why you're smelling smoke today when you didn't before at this time of year or in this location, and what that means for the decision-making process all around. And that communicate, I mean, what Scott said, you bring people up with the idea that smoke is out there, they are more willing to accept that the trade-offs that we're talking about. And if we're really going to try to make the argument that we're putting more prescribed fire on the ground to reduce wildfire and reduce the smoke impacts from that wildfire, that's a lot more prescribed fire than we've ever done before, I think. I mean, just from the research suggests that the reality is that's a lot more prescribed fire than we've done before. And so the communication aspects of that are hugely important. And we shouldn't get into bad, good, everything is bad, everything is good. It's a nuanced discussion, it's a complex discussion, and we should try to be careful about simple answers to complex questions. That those seldom track in a way that's going to be good for everyone. So that would be my closing point here, I guess, in this discussion.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jay. Making sure why there is, fire on the ground. There could be, positive ecological reasons, for it. So these are all opportunities to communicate that information. Megan, any thoughts from you related to communications on any of these topics to help to try to have people better understand what's going on?
Sure. And I, not to belabor the point too much, but I think kind of the best way for me to wrap it up is that we know you know, as Scott and I, and probably all of us at some point have said, you know, we know that inhaling smoke is not good. And I think that just making sure that we are being clear about that messaging while throughout any of this fire processes, making sure we have those open lines of communications and making sure you're at least communicating that there is some risk. Because we've seen is that especially people who are maybe more used to or live closer to burning operations, oftentimes will underestimate their risk when it comes to smoke exposure. And so being realistic that this is still an air pollutant, but there are these benefits to the environment, the ecosystems, and safety and risk is really important. So just making sure that that communication is clear and realistic about human risk is really important.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, one of the stories I had, we were asked when I was with the National Weather Service in Burlington, we worked with a lot of the fire agencies in the area, and we put together an open burning weather awareness campaign, and it was mostly about prescribed fire and some of the hazards, peak fire season, different terminology to try to educate the public, similar to kind of what Scott was talking about, bringing the media involved. And that was our focus, was to provide this information to the media. But the one piece we never had in there was anything related to smoke. And I think now that would be something that another layer to add in to help with any sort of those outreach programs. And it just comes back to this whole idea of just trying to communicate that information and talk to the people, because as we're seeing, the future is going to be smoky, and these are some great tools, and I appreciate the stories that all of you shared about that, because they're all definitely successful ways to try to continue to get the message out about smoke, air quality, health, and safety. So is there any that kind of wraps up the communication side of things? I guess we can kind of go around if there's any other topics before we send it back to Andrea. Is there any other thoughts, closing thoughts that anybody has related to any of the discussions that we've had today that you'd like to share?
I have one quick, and it's more of an operational thing, but one thing I would encourage folks in the northern east, I guess, probably just because it's this kind of a new thing for us. I was just at a state fire meeting in Minnesota, and it is clear that obviously with this increased background smoke, we had last year a lot of air quality alerts, and understanding what that means within your state is important. In the past, we haven't had a lot of air quality alerts, so it really never was an issue. And I guess you or anybody can try to read the tea leaves and figure out how much 2021 or 2023 is going to repeat itself in the future. But at least where I work, it eliminated a lot of days. If people use that as a blanket no burn day, that eliminates a lot of days last year from being able to burn. So it's important to think about what your state and your smoke management plan or other regulatory documents or within your agency what is specifically does it say you can or cannot do under a orange or higher, just as a heads up, because again, other parts of the country deal with this all the time, but this is kind of new for some of us. And so, thinking about maintaining flexibility in those situations is something to consider, but also coordination with other burning agencies is important, because if one agency is not burning, but you are, then there's a story there and somebody's going to need to be able to tell it. So I just throw that out there because it's something that's, again, in the northern part of the East is probably maybe a newer issue. So.
Thanks, Trent. Anyone else? Jay, Scott, or Megan? Any sort of kind of closing thoughts or any additional information and insight?
Yeah, maybe this is a federal government-centric way of thinking a little bit, so bear with me. But I do kind of wonder if the way in which air quality information is provided to the public has become, through a number of different processes and reasons over decades, kind of dispersed through the states in a very real sense. I mean, NOAA doesn't have an official air quality forecast capability. There's air quality alerts and those sorts of things, but they're generally not triggered by like the National Weather Service. It's not a forecasting activity as a rule. It's more, okay, we see something that's happening, and after the consultation with some people at the state level or other stakeholders, then an alert goes out. And is there sort of a need, maybe at the federal level, maybe even at the state level, to coordinate that sort of messaging from what we know, what we can forecast, what the prediction looks like to the public in a way that is maybe less confusing than it is now, is one way of putting it. And I'll to answer my own question, I think there is a need to have that sort of discussion, and the MOU and sort of the cross-cutting discussions that have been mentioned in the comments as well might be a venue for talking about that sort of thing going forward. And I don't want this to be a turf thing. I want to say we're taking that away from you and doing something else, but it just feels like there's a lot of fractionalized information out there that is potentially confusing, certainly to the public and even to many stakeholders and how they make decisions from it. And I think talking about this going forward is a useful thing in my perspective. And smoke is central to that, I would say.
Thanks, Jay. Scott or Megan, any closing thoughts?
I think we all know that this is just a really complicated, complex issue, and there's a lot of people working in this space to try and get to workable, usable information and standards. So it's like, you know, we've provided a lot of resources that are available related to this, excuse me, a broader issue. And I think that, you know, just it's on all of us as researchers, as practitioners, and being part of an active public to keep up to date as much as we can on what's out there and keep sharing that information, keep these lines of communications open. So it's cool that you have these opportunities for us to come talk like this, but hopefully there's other, you know, venues that we can all seek out to keep talking about this as we go forward.
Megan, I really like that last point, you know, because it's all about communication and so much about smoke. I mean, yes, we can develop new tools, we can develop more precise tools, but even with the most precise tool, we're still going to need to communicate what the tool is saying to the public. So communication, and was that one meeting where a few of us started discussing the idea of, is it possible to develop a more clear way of communicating smoke issues? You know, like how we communicate in weather forecasts, the, you know, probability of precipitation. Is there a better way that we can develop to talk about smoke rather than just the AQI is going to be 400 today? Because a lot of smoke impact, you know, isn't necessarily just what the concentration is, it's what the concentration is for how long, you know, is part of determining the impact. So being able to effectively communicate it, you know, may develop some work on, we kind of nicknamed it the language of smoke, and how we communicate what we're actually talking about from these tools. And that's another discussion for another time, but, you know, just kind of gets to this theme of communication is one of the key aspects of smoke.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Trent, Megan, Scott, and Jay. We really appreciate your insight today. Very knowledgeable information that you shared with us. So thank you, and I'll toss it back over to Andrea.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to reiterate, thank you again so much to our panelists, Jay, Trent, Megan, Scott. I really enjoyed today's discussion. And to all of our participants who joined us today, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. This was a really insightful conversation that we had. So again, thank you everyone for participating. Just want to do a quick plug that our next panel discussion will be focused on the phenology of fire, listening to the plants and animals, and we will host that discussion on Thursday, January 18th. So come back next month for our next in this series. There was a couple of comments in the chat that I will reiterate. One, if you'd like to save the chat, there's so much great information, comments that were made, links that were shared. If you're interested in saving that chat, at the bottom of your chat screen, you'll see 3 little dots. You can just click on those and hit save. And that will save the chat so that you can have that as a reference into the future. A lot of the links that were shared in the chat, we're going to mine through and pull those and put those up on both the Northern Research Station and the Fueling Collaboration website. So we'll have those links as references connected back to the recording of this video. And this has been recorded, and so we'll try to get that posting up on the web here within the next week or so. Also, I mentioned it earlier in my introduction, but this panel discussion is approved for continuing ed credits through SAF. If your name is not correct, first and last name in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the participant list, and you are seeking those credits, just please find your name. You should see a couple little dots next to it, select those and hit rename so that we have your complete name so we can submit that to SAF. The final comment I'll make is as we close out this meeting, you should be automatically directed to an evaluation. We really just ask that you take a couple of minutes, please, to respond and fill out that evaluation. The information that you provide is incredibly valuable to us as we are planning future Fueling Collaboration discussions. So with that, again, just want to say thank you, everyone, and I appreciate your time, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.